This story is titled, They Mocked My Obsession with Learning Sign Language Until That Cruise Ship Emergency Changed Everything. I'm Alex, 28M, and for the past 3 years, I've been working as an ESL teacher in Portland, Oregon. My story isn't about teaching English though, it's about how my weird obsession with American Sign Language, ASL, ended up changing not just my life, but the lives of over 200 people on what was supposed to be a relaxing Caribbean cruise. Growing up with my sister Emma, 31F, who has partial hearing loss, I watched her struggle to communicate in a world that wasn't designed for her. While she could manage with hearing aids, I saw how exhausted she would get from constantly straining to understand people in noisy environments. That's what first got me interested in ASL when I was in college. When I moved to Portland for my teaching job, I started taking ASL classes at the local community center. That's where I met Madison, 26F, a kindergarten teacher who quickly became one of my closest friends. She was there because she had a deaf student in her class and wanted to make him feel more included. We'd practice signing together during lunch breaks and after class, sharing teaching stories, and dreaming about how we could make our classrooms more accessible. But not everyone understood my dedication to learning ASL. My roommate Tyler, 27M, and his girlfriend Rachel, 25F, would constantly make fun of me for wasting time learning a language that I would never need to use. They'd mock my signing practice, making exaggerated hand gestures while I was trying to study. Even some of my coworkers at the school would roll their eyes when I talked about incorporating basic ASL into my English lessons. The criticism stung, but I kept at it. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I'd head to my ASL class, ignore the jokes from Tyler and Rachel, and focus on improving. My sister Emma was my biggest supporter, always reminding me that what I was doing mattered. Madison would defend me too, telling me not to listen to the naysayers. I had no idea that my persistence would end up being the difference between life and death during what was supposed to be a simple spring break vacation. Looking back now, I'm grateful that I never let their mockery stop me from learning. But at the time, sitting in my apartment while Tyler and Rachel made their stupid jokes, I was just a guy trying to learn something meaningful while dealing with people who couldn't understand why it mattered. In February 2025, Madison invited me to join her and a group of other teachers on a spring break cruise to the Caribbean. The trip was organized through an educational travel program that offered discounted rates for teachers. I was hesitant at first. Cruises weren't really my thing, and I had been saving up for an intensive ASL summer program. But Madison convinced me that I needed a break from Tyler's constant negativity, and the price was too good to pass up. Our group included Madison, me, and 3 other teachers from different schools in Portland: Olivia, 29F, who taught high school chemistry, Nathan, 32M, a middle school band director, and Christina, 27F, who worked in special education. I didn't know them well, but they seemed nice enough during our pre-trip meetup. What I didn't expect was running into Tyler and Rachel at the cruise terminal in Miami. Apparently, Rachel's parents had gifted them a cruise package for the same dates on the same ship, the Royal Caribbean's Anthem of the Seas. Tyler smirked when he saw me, making exaggerated signing gestures to Rachel, who giggled. I tried to ignore them and focused on getting settled into my cabin, which I was sharing with Nathan. The first 2 days of the cruise were actually pleasant. Our teacher group spent time by the pool, attended shows, and enjoyed the endless buffet. I even managed to avoid Tyler and Rachel most of the time, though I occasionally caught them pointing and laughing when they saw me practicing ASL with Madison during our morning coffee sessions on the deck. What nobody knew was that a potentially catastrophic situation was brewing behind the scenes. The ship's communication systems were experiencing intermittent failures, something the crew was trying to downplay to avoid causing panic. I overheard 2 crew members discussing it in hushed tones while I was getting tea late one night, but I didn't think much of it at the time. On the 3rd night, everything changed. I was sitting at dinner with Madison and the others when the ship suddenly shuddered violently. The lights flickered, and there was a deep, grinding noise that seemed to come from somewhere below us. Within minutes, the main power went out, plunging the massive vessel into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting an eerie red glow throughout the dining room, but that was just the beginning of what would become the longest night of my life. The initial shock of the power failure quickly gave way to confusion and growing anxiety. The ship's crew started moving through the dining room with flashlights, trying to maintain order, but I could see the worry on their faces. Then came the first announcement over the emergency system. There had been a major electrical failure affecting all of the ship's primary communication systems. What made the situation worse was that the backup systems weren't functioning properly either. The emergency announcements were garbled and barely audible in most areas of the ship. In the darkness, I noticed something that others didn't. There was a group of deaf passengers at a corner table who had no idea what was being said in the broken announcements. The crew members were so focused on managing the general chaos that they hadn't realized these passengers were completely in the dark about what was happening. Without thinking twice, I made my way over to their table. There were 4 of them, an elderly couple, and what appeared to be their adult daughter and her husband. The relief on their faces when I started signing was immediate. I explained what little we knew about the situation, and they introduced themselves. Robert, 68M, and Patricia, 65F, their daughter Michelle, 42F, and her husband David, 45M. They had been sitting there for 20 minutes, watching people react to announcements they couldn't hear, growing increasingly frightened. As I was communicating with them, Madison appeared at my side with more news she'd overheard from the crew. The ship had lost power to its navigation systems, and was essentially drifting. The seas were rough, and without proper power to the stabilizers, the ship was starting to roll more severely. We needed to move everyone to the muster stations, but the normal emergency alert systems weren't working properly. I looked around the dining room and spotted at least 3 more tables with deaf passengers. I could tell by their hand movements and the growing looks of confusion on their faces. The crew was trying to evacuate over 2,000 passengers with a broken communication system, and nobody seemed to realize that there was a significant group of people who couldn't hear the already garbled instructions. That's when I saw Tyler and Rachel across the room. They were standing with a group of passengers, and for once, Tyler wasn't laughing. He was watching me sign to the deaf passengers, and for the first time since I'd known him, he wasn't smirking. The ship lurched again, sending plates crashing to the floor, and I knew we were running out of time to get everyone to safety. The next hour was a blur of activity. I quickly explained the situation to Madison and our other teacher friends, and we developed a system. Nathan and Christina would help guide hearing passengers, while Madison would stay with me to assist in communicating with the deaf passengers. Olivia, who knew basic ASL from a summer camp job, would work with the crew to ensure everyone had clear directions to the muster stations. What we discovered was even more concerning than we initially thought. There weren't just a few deaf passengers. There was a deaf senior citizens group from Arizona on board, nearly 40 people in total. They had booked the cruise as part of a community center's annual trip. Most of them had been scattered throughout different areas of the ship when the power failed. The rough seas were making everything more difficult. The ship was rolling badly enough that walking through the corridors required holding onto the walls. Emergency lights cast strange shadows that made navigation confusing, and the few working announcements were now completely inaudible over the sound of the wind and waves. Small groups of passengers were huddled in corners, some crying, others arguing about what to do. I found myself working with Robert, who turned out to be a retired school principal. Despite his age, he was remarkably calm and helped organize the other deaf passengers we located. Together, we moved from deck to deck, using our flashlights to signal other deaf passengers. Madison stayed close, helping to coordinate with the crew and keeping track of numbers. During our search, we came across Tyler and Rachel again. They were trying to help an elderly deaf woman who was clearly distressed, but they couldn't communicate with her. The look on Tyler's face when he waved me over was something I'll never forget, a mixture of desperation and remorse. The woman turned out to be Barbara, 72F, who had gotten separated from the Arizona group and was scared to death. She had no idea where her friends were or what was happening. The situation became even more critical when we reached the lower decks. Water was seeping in through some of the cabin doors, not enough to sink the ship, but enough to cause panic among the passengers we found there. The crew later told us that a seal had been damaged when the power failed, allowing seawater to enter during the heavy rolls. This discovery made our mission even more urgent. We needed to get everyone to the muster stations before the lower decks became too dangerous to navigate. What happened next tested everyone's courage. As we were guiding a group of deaf passengers up from the lower decks, the ship took a massive roll that sent everyone stumbling. The emergency lights in our section failed completely, leaving us in total darkness except for our few flashlights. I could feel the panic rising around me. In complete darkness, the deaf passengers had lost their ability to communicate through sign language. I remembered something from my ASL classes about tactile signing, a method used with deaf-blind individuals where they feel the signs by touch. In the darkness, it was our only option. I quickly taught Madison and Tyler, who had stayed to help, how to make a simple, follow me, sign by drawing on people's palms. We formed a human chain, each person holding onto the shoulder of the person in front of them. The ship's rolling was getting worse, and we could hear items crashing somewhere in the darkness. That's when Rachel, who had been helping guide people despite her obvious fear, spotted something critical. One of the deaf passengers, James, 69M, was missing his emergency life vest. In the chaos of the evacuation, someone had taken it from his cabin storage before he could get to it. Without hesitation, Tyler took off his own vest and gave it to James. I saw this happen in the beam of my flashlight, and it hit me hard. This was the same guy who had spent months mocking my interest in ASL, now putting himself at risk to help someone he couldn't even communicate with properly. When I tried to acknowledge his action, he just shook his head and kept helping people move forward. Our group was one of the last to arrive at the muster station on Deck 4. The scene there was controlled chaos, hundreds of passengers huddled together, crew members trying to maintain order, and the constant sound of the wind and waves outside. The ship's officers had managed to get some emergency power to this area, so there was better lighting. I immediately noticed that the deaf passengers we had helped were quickly finding and reuniting with their friends from the Arizona group, hugging and signing rapidly about their experiences. What nobody expected was what happened next. The ship's captain had been trying to communicate important safety information to all passengers, but the PA system was still barely functioning. That's when Chief Officer Anderson, 45M, approached me with an urgent request that would change everything about how we handled the next critical phase of the emergency. Chief Officer Anderson explained that the ship's engines were completely dead, and we were drifting in rough seas about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. 2 rescue ships were on their way, but the evacuation would be complicated. The passengers would need to be transferred via emergency rafts in groups, a dangerous procedure in the rough conditions. The most critical information needed to be communicated clearly to everyone, including the deaf passengers, as any misunderstanding could be fatal. The chief officer had already noticed how I had been helping coordinate the deaf passengers. He asked if I would stand with him on the elevated platform and translate all emergency instructions into ASL. This wasn't just about basic communication anymore. People's lives would depend on understanding precise instructions about evacuation procedures, timing, and safety protocols. I felt the weight of this responsibility as I climbed onto the platform. Looking out over the crowd, I could see all the faces I'd come to know over the past few hours: Robert and Patricia holding hands tightly, Barbara being comforted by her friends from Arizona, Michelle and David trying to keep others calm. Madison stood near the platform, giving me an encouraging nod. The evacuation instructions were complex. Passengers would need to climb down rope ladders in groups of 6, time their jumps with the waves to land in the life rafts, and help secure others coming down after them. Each group needed to understand their specific roles and timing perfectly. One mistake could send someone into the churning ocean instead of the rescue raft. As I signed the instructions, I noticed something remarkable happening. The deaf passengers who understood the instructions clearly began helping to demonstrate the procedures to hearing passengers around them. They used gestures and body language to show exactly how to grip the rope ladder and time the descent. Their visual communication skills, honed by a lifetime of using sign language, were actually making the instructions clearer for everyone. Tyler and Rachel had positioned themselves near the platform, helping to maintain order in their section. I caught Tyler watching my signing intently, no longer with mockery, but with a kind of dawning comprehension. He was seeing firsthand how ASL could convey complex information more effectively than shouted instructions in a crisis. Through the fear and tension in the air, I could see something changing in his understanding of what language really means. The evacuation began around 3 a.m. The first rescue ship had arrived and was holding position about 50 yards from us, its powerful spotlights illuminating the churning waves between the vessels. The wind was howling, and the sea spray made the deck slippery. Each group's descent into the rescue rafts had to be perfectly coordinated with the waves to prevent accidents. I stayed on the platform, signing continuous updates and instructions. My arms were aching, but I couldn't stop. When Robert and Patricia's group was called to evacuate, I felt my heart racing. They were in their 60s, and would need to climb down that swaying rope ladder in complete darkness except for the rescue ship's spotlights. But they moved with surprising agility, following the instructions perfectly. Patricia even paused halfway down to signal encouragement to those waiting above. Then something went wrong. During the descent of the fourth group, which included Michelle and David, a particularly large wave hit. The rope ladder swung wildly, and David lost his grip. He was hanging by one hand, dangling over the dark water. The crew members couldn't hear Michelle's frantic signing in the chaos, but I could see her clearly from my elevated position. She was signing that David had a bad shoulder from an old injury. He wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. I quickly signed to the crew members manning the ropes, explaining the situation. They immediately implemented their emergency retrieval procedure, using a safety line to secure David and pull him back to a stable position on the ladder. The entire incident lasted less than a minute, but it showed how critical clear communication could be in a rescue situation. The evacuation continued through the night. Barbara and her friends from the Arizona group helped organize the remaining passengers into efficient groups, using the visual systems they had developed earlier. Tyler and Rachel worked tirelessly, helping people get into their life vests and guiding them to the evacuation points. I saw Tyler watching the deaf passengers' hand signals and attempting to copy them to communicate across the noisy deck, something I never thought I'd see. Around 5 a.m., Madison, who had refused to evacuate earlier to help manage the crowds, finally touched my shoulder. My voice was long gone from shouting over the wind, and my arms felt like lead from hours of continuous signing. She pointed to the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were starting to appear. The rescue ship had already taken aboard over half of the passengers, but we still had hundreds more to evacuate before our drifting ship reached the dangerous shallow waters closer to the coast. Just as the sky was beginning to lighten, we faced our biggest challenge yet. The ship's chief engineer rushed to the platform to inform us that the lower decks were taking on more water than expected. The list of the ship was becoming dangerous, and we needed to speed up the evacuation. The remaining passengers would need to be evacuated in larger groups, making the process even more risky. The news hit hard. There were still about 200 passengers left, including some elderly people who had been waiting because of mobility issues. Among them was Eleanor, 85F, a deaf woman who used a walker and was terrified of heights. She had been letting others go ahead of her, but now we had no choice. Everyone needed to get off the ship immediately. The crew began preparing multiple rope ladders for simultaneous evacuations. I had to modify my signing to be more visible in the growing dawn light, using larger movements and more emphatic gestures. The deaf passengers who had already learned the evacuation procedure stayed behind to help, forming a relay system of signed instructions down the line of waiting people. Tyler and Rachel were still there, soaked to the bone and exhausted, but refusing to evacuate until they had helped others. I watched as Tyler used the basic signs he'd picked up during the night to help calm a young deaf boy who was crying, scared of the rope ladder. The transformation in him was complete, from someone who had mocked sign language to someone who understood its power to connect and comfort. Madison organized the remaining passengers into groups, prioritizing those who needed extra assistance. When it came time for Eleanor's group, something remarkable happened. The deaf seniors from Arizona formed a human support system around her. They used tactile signing to guide her movements and helped support her weight as she made her way down the ladder. Their years of communicating without sound had made them experts at conveying complex instructions through touch alone. The ship groaned ominously as the last groups prepared to evacuate. The list had become severe enough that walking on the deck was difficult. Chief Officer Anderson ordered all remaining crew and helpers to evacuate immediately. There was no more time. As I signed his final instructions, I looked at the faces of the last group of passengers. Despite their fear, they were moving with purpose and determination, following the visual guides we had established throughout the night. The sun was fully up by the time the last rescue raft reached the evacuation ship. According to the ship's log, the entire evacuation had taken just over 5 hours. Against all odds, every single passenger had been safely transferred. Not one life was lost. The cruise ship itself was eventually towed to port, though I later learned it took months to repair the damage. In the days that followed, As we all recovered in Miami before flying home, I witnessed something extraordinary. The deaf passengers from Arizona had taught basic ASL to dozens of hearing passengers who had been inspired by what they'd seen during the evacuation. Impromptu signing circles formed in the hotel lobby, with people eagerly learning to communicate in new ways. Tyler approached me on our last day in Miami. He looked uncomfortable, struggling to find the right words. Finally, he lifted his hands and slowly signed. "I'm sorry." He had learned it from Barbara. He admitted that he had never understood the power of ASL until he saw how it had helped save lives that night. Rachel stood beside him, nodding silently. The story made national news, but what touched me most were the letters. Robert and Patricia wrote to my school board about how ASL had been crucial during the evacuation. The Arizona deaf community sent a joint letter thanking everyone involved, with a special mention of how visual communication had proven more effective than verbal instructions during the crisis. A month after returning home, I received an unexpected email from Tyler. He had enrolled in ASL classes at the same community center where I had started. He wasn't the only one. The cruise story had inspired a surge of interest in learning sign language. Madison told me that her school had decided to incorporate ASL into their regular curriculum. My sister Emma cried when I finally told her the whole story. She had always told me that learning ASL was worthwhile, but neither of us had imagined it would prove so crucial. The cruise line now requires at least one crew member fluent in ASL on every ship, a policy change that came directly from our experience. I still teach ESL in Portland, but I also volunteer teaching ASL on weekends. Sometimes, when I'm introducing the basics to a new class, I think about that night on the ship, how a language I learned out of love for my sister ended up helping save hundreds of lives. Tyler occasionally drops by these classes. He doesn't make jokes anymore. Instead, he tells new students about the night he learned that every language, spoken or signed, has the power to change lives. As for the deaf passengers from the cruise, we stay in touch. Every year on the anniversary of the evacuation, we have a video call where both speaking and signing are welcome. Barbara always reminds everyone that communication barriers can be overcome when people make the effort to understand each other. She's right, sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we never need to speak aloud.